King's Life Guard are back. Guard Horse Guards, Royal Guard, King's Guard, Horse, London, 2025. The streets were filled with tourists from around the world, eager to see the historic landmarks they had only read about or seen in movies. Among these landmarks, the Horse Guards Parade held a special place in the hearts of Londoners and visitors alike. It was a wide, open square lined with historic buildings, where soldiers in shining armor and elegant uniforms had marched for centuries. But this year, there was something extra special happening. The King's Life Guard, the famous mounted regiment known for protecting the monarchy, was returning to full active duty. For many, it felt like a piece of history was coming alive once again. Captain Edward Hayes, a tall and disciplined officer, was at the center of it all. His family had a long history of serving in the King's Life Guard. His father and grandfather had worn the same polished boots and shiny helmets, and now it was his turn. Edward had always felt a deep sense of pride when he thought about the legacy of his family. He loved the uniform, the horses, and the traditions, but he also knew that leading a modern unit meant more than just wearing a helmet and carrying a sword. He had to prepare his team to meet the expectations of both history and the present day. The preparations for the return of the King's Life Guard were intense. Every morning, Edward arrived at the stables before sunrise. The air smelled of hay, leather, and the earthy scent of horses. The guards worked quietly, brushing and grooming the animals, checking their hooves and feeding them carefully. The horses were not ordinary animals. They were specially trained for parade and protection. Each one had a strong, calm personality and could remain steady even in the most crowded or noisy situations. Some had been with their riders for years, forming a bond that was almost unbreakable. Edward walked among the horses, gently patting each one and whispering words of encouragement. The soldiers followed his example, understanding that a happy, confident horse was as important as a skilled rider. The riders practiced their drills daily, riding in precise formations, turning sharply, stopping suddenly, and moving as one unit. It was not easy. The weather could be unpredictable, the streets crowded, and the horses sometimes stubborn. But day by day, the team improved, and Edward could see the determination in every guard's eyes. While the horses were being trained, the soldiers also practiced their ceremonial duties. They polished their boots until they shone like mirrors, polished their metal helmets until they gleamed, and adjusted their red and gold uniforms so that every detail was perfect. There was a sense of pride and purpose in the air. Edward often reminded his team that they were not just preparing for a show, they were representing centuries of tradition. Every salute, every step, every movement had meaning. It was a responsibility they did not take lightly. London itself seemed to notice the preparations. Local newspapers wrote stories about the return of the lifeguard, and television channels interviewed soldiers and experts. Social media buzzed with images of horses being groomed and soldiers practicing their formations. People were excited not only to see the parade, but also to witness history being honored in a modern world. Children drew pictures of soldiers on horseback, while older Londoners remembered stories of parades and ceremonies from their youth. There was a sense that the city was holding its breath, waiting for something special to happen. But behind the excitement, Edward knew there were challenges. Times had changed, and the King's Life Guard could no longer be seen as purely ceremonial. The security of the royal family and public events was a serious responsibility. There were new threats, new technologies, and new expectations. Edward often met with security experts and police officers to discuss how the lifeguard could work alongside modern forces. It was a delicate balance. They had to maintain the traditions that made them unique, while also being ready for real-life situations that might arise during parades or public events. Despite these challenges, the atmosphere in the barracks and stables was one of excitement and determination. Edward often walked through the training grounds in the early morning light, watching as soldiers and horses moved together like a single, living machine. There was something magical about the way the horses lifted their hooves in perfect rhythm, the soldiers keeping time, their swords gleaming in the soft light. Visitors who happened to pass by often stopped and stared, amazed at the beauty and precision of it all. It reminded Edward that their work was not only practical, but also inspirational. In the evenings, after long days of training, Edward would sit in the officer's room with a cup of tea and reflect. He thought about the history of the regiment, about the brave men and women who had served before him. He remembered stories his grandfather had told him about riding through the streets of London in times of war and peace, about ceremonies attended by kings and queens, about the camaraderie among soldiers who trusted their lives to each other and their horses. Edward felt a sense of connection to all of them. He realized that being part of the Life Guard was not just a job, it was a calling, a way to honor the past while protecting the present. The team also bonded during quieter moments. They shared stories in the stables, laughed when a young horse acted stubborn, and celebrated small victories when a drill was performed perfectly. Edward made sure to remind everyone that their strength came from unity. No single soldier or horse could perform the duties alone. It was the combination of skill, trust, and respect that made the regiment effective. Each guard understood that they were part of something larger than themselves, and that thought gave them pride and confidence. As the day of the parade drew nearer, the city grew more aware of the significance of the return. Londoners began to talk about it in cafes, schools, and offices. Tourists made plans to be in the right spot at the right time. Even the weather seemed to cooperate, as if the city itself wanted to honor the event. Edward and his team felt the pressure but also the excitement. Every practice ride, every polished boot, every careful grooming of a horse was a step closer to the moment when the Life Guard would be seen once again in full glory. Edward often imagined the scene in his mind. The king watching proudly, the horses moving in perfect formation, the guards holding their swords high, and the crowds cheering respectfully. It was more than a parade. It was a statement that history and tradition were alive and well. It was a reminder that even in a fast-moving modern world, there were things worth preserving, things that connected people across generations. Edward knew that when the day came, it would be a moment he and his team would never forget. And so, the days passed with careful preparation, discipline, and quiet anticipation. Edward and his soldiers worked tirelessly, knowing that their efforts were not just for show but for something much deeper. They were readying themselves to step into history, to honor the past, and to protect the present. The King's Life Guard was back, and London was ready to watch, proud and expectant, as the city prepared to witness a living tradition come to life once again. As the day of the parade drew closer, the excitement in London grew, but so did the tension. Captain Edward Hayes could feel it in the air. The preparations for the King's Life Guard had gone smoothly, but he knew that tradition alone would not be enough. Times had changed, and the world around them was far more unpredictable than it had ever been. While the streets of London were often calm and orderly, recent events had reminded everyone that even the most peaceful city could face sudden disruptions. Edward's role was no longer just about maintaining tradition. It was about making sure the guards could handle real situations with skill, courage, and discipline. It started quietly, with small incidents that seemed harmless at first. During a routine morning drill, a group of tourists wandered too close to the parade practice. The guards, mounted on their magnificent horses, had to quickly maneuver to guide the crowd back to safety. It was a minor issue, but it highlighted a problem Edward had been considering for months. The streets were no longer empty for parades and drills, and there were always unexpected distractions. He gathered his team after the incident, emphasizing that the parade was more than a display of skill. It was a test of focus, patience, and the ability to react calmly under pressure. Then came the news that shook Edward more deeply. A minor security breach had occurred at a royal event in another part of the city. No one was hurt, but it was a reminder that even in modern London, threats could appear suddenly and without warning. Newspapers covered the story extensively, and television channels debated whether traditional guards on horseback could ever truly be effective in protecting the royal family. Social media was full of opinions. Some people admired the idea of blending history with modern security, while others criticized it, saying horses and swords were no match for contemporary challenges. Edward took the news seriously. He knew that the lifeguard could not simply rely on appearances. Their role was more than ceremonial. It was about discipline, skill, and readiness. He called a meeting with senior officers to discuss what changes might be needed. They reviewed security plans, coordinated with local police, and explored ways to integrate modern safety measures without losing the essence of their tradition. It was a delicate balance. They could not turn the parade into a heavily guarded fortress, but they also could not ignore the realities of the modern world. The soldiers felt the pressure too. Young recruits who had joined for the prestige of wearing the uniform and riding the horses suddenly realized the seriousness of their responsibilities. They had trained for months, but now the stakes felt higher than ever. Every drill, every horse maneuver, every salute became a test of skill and focus. Edward noticed the tension in their movements. Some were hesitant during exercises, unsure if they were ready for the unpredictable challenges that might arise. He made it a point to encourage them, reminding them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. One afternoon, during a particularly intense drill, Edward decided to simulate a real-life scenario. The guards were practicing a formation when a loud, unexpected noise was introduced, a group of volunteers banging metal objects to mimic a disturbance. The horses were startled, some stepping back and others spinning in place. Edward quickly directed the guards, using calm, precise commands to guide the animals back into formation. The exercise was difficult, but it was exactly what Edward wanted. It showed the team that even in the face of chaos, focus, discipline, and teamwork could restore order. The soldiers were tired but proud of their ability to manage the situation. Meanwhile, the city outside the stables was abuzz with curiosity. Reporters began visiting the barracks, cameras capturing the horses being groomed and the soldiers practicing. Some journalists asked questions that Edward found challenging. Can horses really be useful in modern security? One reporter asked. Is this parade more for show than protection? Edward answered carefully, explaining that the lifeguard had always been more than a symbol. Their training, discipline, and ability to move quickly through crowded streets gave them unique value. He emphasized that tradition and practicality could coexist, and that every member of the lifeguard understood the importance of both. Despite Edward's careful preparation, tensions reached a peak one evening when a minor incident occurred near the stables. A small protest had started in the streets, just a few blocks from Horse Guard's parade. The demonstration was peaceful at first, but the crowd grew quickly, spilling into nearby roads. Pedestrians, tourists, and vehicles were caught in the middle, creating confusion and potential danger. Edward and his officers realized that this was a real test of the lifeguard's ability to respond effectively. They mounted their horses, took their positions, and coordinated with the police to manage the situation. It was not easy. Horses are powerful and intelligent animals, but they also respond to fear and sudden movement. Edward and his soldiers had to guide the horses carefully, maintaining calm while controlling the flow of people. The crowd was noisy and the atmosphere was tense, but the training of the lifeguard became evident. The soldiers communicated with subtle signals, guiding the horses and maintaining order. The public watched in amazement as the mounted guards moved gracefully, yet purposefully, creating safe passages and keeping everyone calm. What had begun as a potentially chaotic situation was managed efficiently, thanks to months of preparation and practice. After the incident, Edward gathered his team in the stables. Everyone was exhausted, but there was a sense of accomplishment in the air. The soldiers had faced a real challenge and had performed admirably. Edward praised their focus, bravery, and teamwork. He reminded them that this experience was exactly why their training mattered. It was one thing to perform perfectly during drills in quiet streets, but it was another to remain calm and effective when the unexpected happened in the real world. The lifeguard had proven they could rise to the occasion. The experience also brought lessons that Edward and his officers would not forget. They realized that modern challenges required a combination of tradition, intelligence, and adaptability. The horses were not just ceremonial. Their presence commanded attention and respect. The soldiers were not just performers. Their skills, discipline, and decision-making abilities made them a real protective force. Edward knew that the next parade would not only be a display of history, but also a demonstration of the lifeguard's capability to meet modern demands. In the following days, Edward and his team adjusted their training based on what they had learned. They practiced drills that included sudden noises, crowds, and unexpected obstacles. They focused on communication, ensuring that every soldier could respond to signals quickly and accurately. The horses were gradually exposed to more complex environments, helping them remain calm in stressful situations. Edward emphasized that every small exercise contributed to a larger purpose: the safety of the king, the public, and the reputation of the Life Guard. The tension in London remained palpable. Citizens, tourists, and media outlets were all aware that the parade was approaching, and expectations were high. Some people doubted that a centuries-old tradition could function effectively in the modern world, while others eagerly anticipated seeing the Life Guard in full action. Edward felt the weight of these expectations, but he also felt pride in his team. They were not only preserving history, they were demonstrating its relevance, showing that courage, discipline, and unity never went out of style. At night, when the city grew quiet and the streets dimmed, Edward often walked among the stables, checking on the horses and reflecting on the recent challenges. The animals had proven their intelligence and resilience, remaining calm and responsive despite the unexpected disturbances. The soldiers had demonstrated determination and teamwork, handling difficult situations with skill and composure. Edward felt a deep sense of confidence that, when the day of the parade arrived, the Life Guard would perform flawlessly, not just as a spectacle, but as a real protective force. Even as the excitement of the approaching parade built, Edward reminded his team that humility and preparation were just as important as courage and skill. They were guardians of history and protectors of the present, and every drill, every exercise, every small decision contributed to their readiness. The recent challenges had tested them, but they had emerged stronger, more disciplined, and more united than ever. The King's Life Guard was no longer just a symbol. It was a living, breathing force capable of handling the unexpected. And so, as the streets of London continued to buzz with anticipation, Edward and his soldiers focused on their duties. Each day brought new exercises, careful preparations, and quiet reflections on the lessons they had learned. The parade was still days away, but the Life Guard had already faced challenges that tested their skill, courage, and unity. When the moment came for them to return to the streets in full regalia, they would be ready, not just to display tradition, but to demonstrate the strength and resilience that had defined their regiment for centuries. The morning of the first official parade had finally arrived, and London seemed to hold its breath. Streets that were normally filled with the bustle of cars and pedestrians were now lined with barriers and spectators eager to witness a historic moment. Tourists jostled for the best view, cameras clicked incessantly, and the air was alive with excitement. Captain Edward Hayes stood tall on the edge of the parade ground, watching his soldiers and their magnificent horses take their positions. His heart was steady, but he could feel the tension in the air. Today, months of preparation, drills, and lessons learned from past challenges would be put to the ultimate test. Edward had walked through this moment countless times in his mind. He had imagined perfect formations, gleaming armor, and proud horses moving as one. Yet he also knew that the streets of London were unpredictable. Unexpected events could arise at any moment. The recent incidents of minor disturbances had reminded him that even a parade could become chaotic if the guards were not prepared. He scanned the crowd and the barriers, assessing potential risks while keeping his focus on the formation. Every detail mattered: the placement of soldiers, the spacing between horses, and the calm demeanor of the animals. The soldiers were in position, their uniforms spotless, swords gleaming and helmets polished to perfection. Each horse was calm but alert, sensing the anticipation in the air. The guards had spent months building trust with their animals, learning to communicate with subtle shifts in weight, slight hand movements, and quiet verbal cues. The bond between horse and rider was almost unspoken but undeniable. Edward could see the focus in the soldiers' eyes. They were ready, not just to perform a ceremony, but to respond to whatever might come their way. As the king arrived at the parade ground, a cheer rose from the crowd. Edward saluted sharply, and his team responded with precise, coordinated movements. The horses moved in perfect rhythm, the soldiers' steps matching one another as though guided by a single mind. It was a display of discipline and unity that drew gasps of admiration from the spectators. Cameras flashed and news helicopters circled above, capturing every moment. The parade seemed to be going perfectly, a flawless return of tradition to the heart of London. But then the unexpected happened. From the far end of the street, a protest began to move closer to the parade route. It started as a small group of people holding signs and chanting slogans. At first, it seemed harmless, nothing more than a minor distraction. Edward, however, immediately recognized the potential danger. A crowd of any size, moving unpredictably, could startle the horses or interfere with the guards' formation. He called out instructions in calm but firm tones, signaling his team to adjust their positions and prepare for possible interference. The parade could not stop, yet they had to maintain safety for both the royal party and the public. The protest grew faster than anyone anticipated. More people joined, spilling onto the edges of the barriers and moving closer to the parade ground. Edward's heart beat faster, but his face remained composed. He knew that panic could be contagious, and the horses, sensitive as they were, could sense fear. With a steady voice, he directed the guards to form a wider protective line, guiding their horses in careful, controlled movements. Every rider was aware of their responsibility, not only to maintain the formation, but also to keep the horses calm and prevent any accidents. As the crowd pressed forward, some individuals tried to cross the barriers, testing the limits of the parade's organization. Edward acted quickly, signaling specific guards to intercept and gently guide the crowd back. The horses moved with precision, their strength and agility allowing them to respond to sudden movements without causing harm. The combination of the soldiers, training, and the horses' responsiveness created a protective barrier that prevented the situation from escalating. The crowd, realizing that the mounted guards were calm but firm, began to step back, creating space and restoring order. In the midst of the tension, Edward remained vigilant. His eyes scanned the crowd constantly, aware of every sudden movement, every loud noise, and every person approaching too closely. The challenge was unlike any drill they had practiced. It was unpredictable, real, and fast-moving. Yet, the months of preparation paid off. Each soldier moved instinctively, communicating with subtle signals that only they and their horses understood. It was a dance of discipline, courage, and trust, executed under pressure in front of thousands of watching eyes. One particularly tense moment occurred when a sudden loud noise startled one of the horses near the front of the formation. The animal reared slightly, its rider maintaining a firm grip and calm voice to restore composure. Edward quickly redirected nearby guards to support the situation, and within seconds, the horse returned to its steady rhythm. The crowd murmured in awe, watching the display of control and skill. It was clear to everyone present that the lifeguard was not only ceremonial but capable of handling unexpected challenges with poise. The parade continued, the tension slowly easing as the guards maintained order and ensured safety. The king proceeded along the route, observing the precision and professionalism of the mounted guards. The crowd cheered not only for the royal presence but also for the discipline and bravery of the soldiers. Reporters scribbled notes and broadcast live updates, capturing the blend of tradition and modern effectiveness on display. Edward felt a deep sense of pride in his team. They had faced a real-world challenge and had succeeded, proving that their months of preparation were more than just practice. They were vital training for unpredictable moments like this. As the parade drew to its planned conclusion, Edward and his team guided the horses back to the stables with care. Each animal received attention, water, and gentle pats for their courage and patience. The soldiers, exhausted but exhilarated, reflected on what had just occurred. They had faced a turning point in their return to public duty. The event had demonstrated that the lifeguard could adapt to unexpected circumstances, combining the grace of history with the practicality of modern readiness. Edward took a moment to speak to his team privately. He praised their focus, their courage, and their ability to remain calm under pressure. He reminded them that this experience was more than a single parade. It was proof that their regiment could honor tradition while protecting the public in real time. The soldiers nodded, feeling a renewed sense of confidence. They understood that their role was not just to perform, but to serve, to be guardians of history and protectors of the present. The city of London also felt the impact of the event. The crowd and media reported widely on the parade, emphasizing not only the beauty and precision of the ceremony, but also the skill and discipline of the guards in managing the unexpected protest. People began to see the Life Guard in a new light, not just as symbols of the monarchy, but as capable, courageous professionals who could handle real challenges. Edward knew that this moment would be remembered for years to come, a defining point in the history of the regiment. In the days following the parade, Edward reflected on the lessons learned. Training, discipline, and trust in the horses and each other had made the difference. Preparation had been key, but adaptability had been equally important. The Life Guard had proven that even centuries-old traditions could remain relevant in a modern world. Edward shared these insights with his team, encouraging them to continue practicing, learning, and growing. They had faced a turning point and had emerged stronger, more united, and more capable than ever. The success of the parade and the handling of the protest also brought recognition from higher authorities. Military officials, city leaders, and members of the royal household praised the Life Guard for their professionalism. Edward felt a sense of accomplishment, but also humility. The parade had been a test, and while they had succeeded, he knew that vigilance and preparation could never end. Each day presented new challenges, and the lifeguard's role would continue to demand courage, focus, and teamwork. As London returned to its normal rhythm after the parade, the streets, parks, and landmarks carried a sense of renewed pride. Tourists shared stories of the spectacular display, while locals talked about the bravery and skill of the soldiers. Edward, walking through the stables at dusk, watched his team tend to the horses and reflect on the day. The turning point had been challenging, intense, and unpredictable, but it had also been a moment of triumph. It showed that history and modern reality could coexist, that courage and preparation could shine when needed most, and that the king's lifeguard was ready for whatever the future might hold. Edward looked around at the calm horses, the disciplined soldiers, and the quiet streets of London, feeling a sense of connection to every past generation that had worn the uniform. He knew that the turning point they had faced would become part of the stories told about this parade. It would be remembered as a moment when tradition met real-life challenges, and both had succeeded together. The King's Lifeguard had returned, not just as a symbol of history, but as a living, adaptable, and capable force. The days after the parade were filled with a mixture of relief, pride, and reflection for Captain Edward Hayes and the members of the King's Lifeguard. The streets of London had returned to their usual rhythm, but the city seemed subtly changed. People walked a little taller, spoke a little more excitedly about the parade, and shared stories of the incredible mounted guards who had not only displayed tradition, but had handled an unexpected challenge with courage and skill. Edward, walking through the stables early one morning, could see the quiet pride on the faces of his soldiers as they tended to the horses. Each horse received gentle pats and careful attention, as if their riders understood that these animals had played a key role in a successful and historic day. Edward's team had been through an extraordinary experience. The parade had not gone exactly as planned, but it had gone better than anyone could have imagined under the circumstances. They had faced a real challenge, a crowd that moved unpredictably, loud noises, and the pressure of thousands of watching eyes, and had managed it with grace and professionalism. This success had consequences that reached far beyond the stables. The lifeguard was no longer simply a ceremonial unit in the eyes of the public. They were now recognized as a capable and adaptable protective force. News outlets, both local and international, highlighted their skill, praising the soldiers for demonstrating courage under pressure and proving the relevance of centuries-old tradition in a modern city. The public reaction was extraordinary. Crowds that had once gathered merely to watch a ceremonial parade were now filled with admiration and respect for the men and women on horseback. Social media exploded with videos of the parade and the guards' quick and calm response to the protest. Comments poured in, with people expressing amazement at how the soldiers and horses worked together so seamlessly. A perfect blend of history and modern skill, wrote one commentator. Brave, disciplined, and professional, posted another. Edward read these messages quietly in his office, feeling a mix of pride and humility. The recognition was gratifying, but he knew that the true value of the parade lay not in applause, but in the lessons learned and the teamwork demonstrated. The higher authorities also took note. Military leaders, city officials, and members of the royal household commended the lifeguard for their performance. Letters of appreciation were sent to the barracks, highlighting not only the skill of the soldiers, but also the careful preparation that had allowed them to respond effectively under pressure. Edward received personal congratulations for his leadership, though he remained modest. He understood that the success was not his alone. It belonged to every soldier who had trained tirelessly, every horse who had remained calm in the chaos, and every member of the team who had contributed to the months of preparation. Within the regiment, the atmosphere was one of renewed confidence. The soldiers had faced an unprecedented challenge, and their success strengthened the bonds among them. They spoke to one another about the parade, recounting moments when quick thinking or subtle communication had prevented potential accidents. Laughter often followed as they recalled minor mishaps or unexpected behaviors from the horses during the stressful moments. These conversations were not just about pride. They were about learning, reflecting, and understanding the depth of their responsibilities. The lifeguard was more than a team. It was a family bound by trust, discipline, and shared experience. The experience also inspired new training programs. Edward and his officers reviewed the parade in detail, analyzing every movement, every decision, and every reaction. They identified areas where small improvements could make a significant difference and developed exercises to prepare for a wider variety of scenarios. They began training in more complex urban environments, simulating situations with crowds, traffic, and sudden noises. Horses were gradually exposed to new challenges, building their confidence and responsiveness. The goal was to ensure that the lifeguard would be ready for anything, maintaining both the ceremonial precision that defined their history and the practical skills necessary for modern protection. Edward also reflected on the importance of public perception. The parade had not been a simple display. It had been a statement to the world that history, skill, and modern relevance could coexist. Londoners and visitors alike had witnessed a living tradition in action, one that was capable of adapting to the present without losing its identity. The success had strengthened the relationship between the lifeguard and the public, creating a sense of trust and admiration. Edward understood that this trust was fragile. It had to be maintained through continued discipline, professionalism, and attention to detail. Meanwhile, the soldiers continued to build their own sense of pride. They spoke with local schools and community groups, explaining the history of the lifeguard, the importance of training, and the lessons learned from the recent events. Children were fascinated by the stories of the horses and the courage of the soldiers, while older citizens shared memories of parades from decades past. These interactions reminded the guards that their role extended beyond the parade ground. They were ambassadors of history, educators of tradition, and living examples of discipline and responsibility. The success of the parade also brought a renewed sense of purpose to Edward himself. For months, he had carried the weight of responsibility, knowing that the eyes of London and the royal household were upon him and his team. The turning point during the parade had tested his leadership, decision-making, and ability to remain calm under pressure. The results had proven that preparation, trust, and adaptability were more important than any one skill alone. Edward realized that leadership was not about authority. It was about guiding a team through challenges, instilling confidence, and ensuring that every member understood the value of their contribution. In addition to professional recognition, the event had a personal impact on Edward. He thought about the generations of his family who had served in the Life Guard. He imagined his father and grandfather observing the parade from above, proud of the continuity of tradition and the courage demonstrated by the new generation. Edward felt a deep connection to the past, a sense of carrying forward a legacy that was larger than himself. At the same time, he understood that the present demanded innovation, adaptability, and responsiveness. Balancing the past with the present had been the greatest lesson of all. The horses, too, received attention and care after the parade. Trainers and riders worked together to ensure that each animal was rested, healthy, and comfortable. These horses were more than animals. They were partners in the success of the Life Guard. Their intelligence, strength, and calm demeanor had been tested, and they had proven their value. Edward often spent quiet moments in the stables, observing the horses, feeling a sense of respect and gratitude for their role. It was a reminder that success depended on harmony between humans and animals, trust between rider and mount, and the careful cultivation of skill over time. As weeks passed, the story of the parade and the lifeguard's performance continued to inspire the city. Visitors returned to see the stables, learn about the history, and witness the guards in practice drills. The regiment's reputation grew stronger, attracting new recruits eager to be part of a team that combined tradition, skill, and courage. Edward oversaw the recruitment process, ensuring that every new member understood the responsibilities, values, and pride associated with serving in the King's Life Guard. It was clear that the events of the parade had far-reaching consequences, shaping the future of the regiment in ways no one could have predicted. Edward also considered the broader significance of the parade. In a world that was fast-paced, modern, and often focused on technology, the return of the King's Life Guard reminded people of the value of discipline, teamwork, and courage. The soldiers and horses were living symbols of history, demonstrating that even traditions centuries old could remain relevant and powerful. Edward felt a sense of fulfillment in knowing that their work had inspired not only admiration, but also reflection. People began to understand that strength came not only from weapons or machines, but also from training, trust, and unity. Finally, Edward gathered his team for a quiet meeting in the stables. He praised their courage, professionalism, and the way they had handled the unexpected challenges. He reminded them that every parade, every drill, and every moment spent training was preparation for the unknown. The lifeguard had faced a turning point, emerged stronger, and proven their worth not just to the public but to themselves. The soldiers listened attentively, absorbing the words of their captain and feeling a renewed sense of pride and purpose. The parade and its aftermath had brought consequences that extended far beyond a single day. The King's Life Guard had gained recognition, respect, and renewed relevance. The soldiers had developed confidence, teamwork, and resilience. The horses had proven their skill and reliability, and Edward, as their leader, had learned that preparation, trust, and adaptability were the keys to success. The experience had been transformative, leaving a lasting impact on every member of the regiment and the city that had witnessed their return. As London continued its daily life, the memory of the parade and the performance of the King's Life Guard remained vivid. People spoke of the event with admiration. Schools taught lessons about courage and tradition, and visitors sought to understand the history and skill behind the mounted soldiers. Edward watched his team with quiet satisfaction, knowing that their efforts had changed perceptions, strengthened the regiment, and inspired the city. The consequences of their actions were clear. The King's Life Guard had returned not just as a symbol, but as a living, adaptable, and respected force, ready to continue their mission for generations to come. After the parade and the days of recognition that followed, Captain Edward Hayes found himself walking through the quiet streets of London in the early morning. The city had returned to its usual rhythm, yet there was a subtle change in the air. People still spoke of the King's Life Guard, of the bravery and precision they had displayed, and of the pride the regiment had brought to the city. Edward felt a sense of calm satisfaction, but he also knew that true reflection required more than pride. It required understanding the lessons that had been learned, the growth that had occurred, and the meaning behind every action taken by the guards and their horses. Edward often visited the stables in the early hours when the city was still waking. The horses, his constant companions, stood quietly, their eyes soft and trusting. He walked among them, patting their strong necks and checking their health, grateful for their role in the success of the parade. Each horse had demonstrated courage, intelligence, and composure, and Edward knew that without them, the regiment could not have faced the challenges so effectively. It was a quiet reminder that success was never achieved alone. It was built on trust, teamwork, and mutual respect. The soldiers, too, spent time reflecting. Many gathered in small groups at the barracks, speaking quietly about the events of the parade and the unexpected moments that had tested them. They shared stories of how subtle gestures, clear communication, and calm thinking had prevented potential accidents. Some laughed as they recalled the reactions of the horses, to sudden noises, or the nervous movements of tourists who had stepped too close. These conversations were not only about reliving the events, they were about learning, understanding, and appreciating the depth of responsibility that came with being a member of the King's Life Guard. Edward himself reflected on his role as a leader. He had carried the responsibility of guiding his team through months of preparation, drills, and finally, the real-life challenge of the parade. Leadership, he realized, was not about commands or authority alone. It was about patience, empathy, and the ability to instill confidence in others. Every instruction given, every correction made, and every encouragement offered had shaped the outcome. Edward thought about how the soldiers had trusted him, how they had responded to his guidance, and how together they had created a display of unity, courage, and professionalism. The reflection brought him both humility and pride. The experience also deepened Edward's connection to history. Walking through the stables, he imagined the generations of his family who had served in the Life Guard before him. He remembered stories his grandfather had told of parades in times of war and peace, of ceremonies attended by kings and queens, and of the camaraderie that bound soldiers together. Edward realized that the events of 2025 were part of a living history, a continuation of a legacy that extended far beyond himself. Every careful movement, every practice drill, and every moment of courage was a link in a chain that connected past, present, and future. The city of London, too, seemed to understand the significance of the Life Guard's return. Visitors from around the world came to witness the regiment, not just for the spectacle, but for the story it told. Schools included lessons about the parade, teaching children about discipline, teamwork, and courage. Locals spoke with admiration about the guards, understanding that their presence was more than ceremonial. It was a demonstration of dedication, professionalism, and respect for tradition. The Life Guard had become a symbol not only of history, but also of values that transcended time. Edward also thought about the lessons for his team. He reminded them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. He emphasized that preparation and practice were the foundation for confidence and success. He encouraged each soldier to reflect on the parade and the unexpected challenges, to understand their own growth, and to recognize the value of teamwork. Every lesson learned was a tool that would prepare them for future challenges, whether in ceremonial duties, public events, or unexpected real-world situations. The horses, for their part, continued to play an essential role in the Life Guard's story. Edward spent time with each animal, appreciating their intelligence, patience, and loyalty. He knew that the bond between horse and rider was more than training. It was a relationship built on trust, communication, and mutual respect. The horses had remained calm under pressure, had responded to subtle cues, and had supported the soldiers through unpredictable moments. Edward understood that this partnership was at the heart of the regiment's success. It was a living reminder that strength and courage are often shared, not owned alone. As weeks passed, Edward encouraged the soldiers to take time for personal reflection. They wrote journals, recorded their experiences, and discussed the parade and its aftermath in small groups. These reflections allowed them to process what they had experienced, to celebrate their achievements, and to acknowledge areas where they could improve. Edward believed that reflection was as important as training. It helped solidify lessons learned and prepared the team for future challenges. The Life Guard was not just a symbol of history. It was a living, evolving organization, capable of growth and adaptation. Edward also thought about the broader meaning of the Life Guard's role in London. The parade and the handling of the unexpected protest had shown that tradition and modern relevance could coexist. The regiment's discipline, skill, and courage had captured the admiration of the public, demonstrating that history was not static or distant. It was alive, meaningful, and inspiring. Edward felt a sense of fulfillment in knowing that the lifeguard had inspired others, reminding people that dedication, teamwork, and respect for history were values worth preserving. The soldiers continued their duties with renewed purpose. Daily drills, horse care, and ceremonial preparation became opportunities to reinforce the lessons of the parade. Edward emphasized that every action, no matter how small, contributed to the integrity of the regiment. The lifeguard was not simply a performance. It was a responsibility, a calling, and a living example of courage and professionalism. The experiences of 2025 had strengthened their sense of identity and purpose, creating a team more united and capable than ever before. Edward also reflected on the importance of humility. While the parade had been a success, he understood that the lifeguard's duty was ongoing. Each day brought new challenges, and preparation and vigilance could never end. The recognition, praise, and admiration were meaningful, but they were not the goal. The true measure of success was in the continued dedication, discipline, and willingness to serve. Edward reminded his soldiers that every parade, every training session, and every interaction with the public was an opportunity to honor the legacy of the lifeguard and to demonstrate the values they represented. The experience also reinforced Edward's belief in the power of teamwork. Every member of the regiment had contributed to the parade's success, from the newest recruit to the most experienced officer. Each soldier, horse, and trainer played a role, and the combination of skill, trust, and communication had made the difference. Edward often reflected on moments when quick thinking, subtle signals, or coordinated movements had prevented potential accidents. These moments were reminders that no individual alone could achieve the level of excellence demonstrated. Success was a collective effort, built on respect, discipline, and mutual support. Edward also considered the impact on the public. The parade had inspired admiration, respect, and a renewed interest in history. People had witnessed courage, professionalism, and skill in action, and they had seen how tradition could remain relevant in a modern world. Edward realized that the lifeguard's role was not only to protect, but also to educate and inspire. Every salute, every movement, and every display of discipline was a lesson for those watching. The regiment had become a living bridge between past and present, showing that values like courage, teamwork, and dedication are timeless. In quiet moments, Edward reflected on his own personal growth. Leading the Life Guard through preparation, unexpected challenges, and the successful parade had taught him patience, resilience, and the importance of trust. He understood that leadership was a responsibility to guide, protect, and inspire, rather than to control. The lessons he had learned would shape not only his career, but also the future of the regiment. Edward felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that he had helped preserve a tradition, strengthen a team, and inspire a city. As the weeks turned into months, the King's Lifeguard continued to perform their duties with pride and excellence. The parade and its aftermath remained a defining moment, a story that would be shared for generations. The soldiers and horses had proven their courage, skill, and relevance, and Edward continued to guide them with wisdom, patience, and respect. The regiment was stronger, more united, and more prepared than ever before. Finally, Edward often stood quietly at the stables in the early morning light, watching the horses stretch, breathe, and move with grace. He thought about the soldiers who had faced unexpected challenges, about the city that had witnessed their courage, and about the legacy that connected past, present, and future. He realized that the story of the King's Life Guard was more than a parade. It was a living example of trust, teamwork, courage, and dedication. The lessons learned, the bonds formed, and the pride shared would remain forever. Edward smiled as he walked among his team, the quiet pride in their eyes reflecting his own. The lifeguard had faced challenges, proven their strength, and honored history. They had demonstrated that courage and skill, discipline and trust could shine even in unpredictable circumstances. And as London continued its life around them, the King's Life Guard stood ready, a living symbol of tradition, unity, and resilience. Their story was not finished. It had only grown stronger, inspiring all who witnessed it and leaving a legacy that would endure for generations.